The porcelain cup was a stark, cool white against the dark hand that held it. A tremor ran through the fingers, not from fear but from a terrible, focused energy. The only sound in the opulent bedroom was the wet, ragged draw of breath from the figure on the bed. The air tasted of stale sweat and a cloying medicinal sweetness. A whisper thin as parchment escaped the sick man's lips. "It tastes like almonds and bitterness." The hand tilting the cup did not falter. A single dark drop fell onto the Persian rug below. Then from the hallway, the faint, haunting melody of a woman's lullaby. The Louisiana sun was a merciless brass eye in a bleached white sky. It baked the earth, pulling the scent of mud and decay from the bayou, a thick perfume that mingled with the overwhelming, sickly sweet smell of boiling cane. This was Whitethorn Plantation, 1852, a kingdom of sugar built on a foundation of suffering. The air vibrated with the shriek of cicadas and the constant groaning turn of the sugar mill. Figures moved through the cane fields like ghosts, their backs bent, their faces shielded from the heat by ragged cloths. By the ox carts laden high with cut cane, an old woman named Sarah stirred a small pot over a tiny safe fire. Her hands, stained dark by soil and herbs, moved with a slow, ancient rhythm. A young man, Ben, wiped sweat from his brow, his muscles straining as he adjusted a heavy load. His back, even at 18, was a map of old welts. "Master promises an extra ration of molasses if we beat the yield from last year," Ben said, his voice carrying a hint of desperate hope. He watched the big house in the distance, its white columns gleaming like bones. Sarah didn't look up from her brew, a bitter tea for a woman in the quarters suffering from fever. "Promises from a Whitethorn are like sugar in the rain, child. They sweeten nothing for long." Her eyes, when she finally glanced at him, held a deep, still water of sorrow. She saw his hope, and it pained her more than the cruelty. Hope was a dangerous luxury here. A bell clanged in the distance, a harsh metallic sound that cut through the humid air. The line of workers shifted, a collective sigh moving through them like a breeze through the cane. The grinding would continue until deep into the night, the fires of the mill painting the sky in hellish orange. This was the engine of Whitethorn, a machine fueled by sweat and sorrow, and its rhythm was as relentless as the beating of a heart. Ben hefted another stalk onto the cart. "Maybe this time it will be different." Sarah handed him a cup of water. "The only thing that changes, boy, is the depth of the roots. The cane grows back thicker each year. So does the master's greed." She nodded toward the end of the field where the overseer, Thomas Calhoun, sat on his horse, a whiskey flask glinting in his hand. "Watch that one. He's a snake with a sore head today." The fear was palpable, a taste like copper on the tongue. This was not just a place of work. It was a world unto itself, with its own laws, its own economy of pain, and its own slow, grinding pace towards an inevitable reckoning. The memory was a splash of green in a world of dust and gold. Years earlier, the cabin steps were warm under a young boy's bare legs. Isaiah, no more than 8, watched his mother, Alara, her voice a soft hum that wove through the twilight. The song was an old one, about a river that carried souls back to a homeland no one could remember. The melody was a comfort, a thread of beauty in a hard life. His father, Marcus, sat on a stump, a piece of pine wood in his large, capable hands. With a small knife, he was carving, the shavings curling onto the ground. He was a quiet man, his strength evident in the stillness of his posture. He handed the finished piece to Isaiah. It was a small bird, its wings swept back as if in flight. "So you remember," Marcus said, his voice deep and warm, "that there's a world above the cane." Isaiah clutched the bird, feeling the smooth grain of the wood. It was perfect. Alara smiled, but her eyes always held a shadow. The moment was fragile, a soap bubble shimmering in the air. It popped with the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Thomas Calhoun reined in his horse, splattering mud onto the clean-swept yard. Behind him was Master Alistair Whitethorn, a tall, severe man on a sleek mare. "Marcus," Alistair said, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. "A trader from Natchez is here. I've incurred a debt. You're to go with him." There was no anger, no malice. It was a simple statement of accountancy. A transaction. Alara's humming stopped. The silence was louder than any scream. She stood up slowly, her hand going to her throat. Marcus rose to his feet, the carving knife hanging limp at his side. He looked from Alistair to his wife to his son. The fight drained out of him before it even began. Resistance was a death sentence for them all. "Take your things," Calhoun grunted, dismounting with a jangle of spurs. Marcus had no things. He walked to Isaiah and knelt, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Be strong for your mama, remember the bird." He touched Ilara's cheek, a fleeting gesture, and then he was walking away between Calhoun and the master, not looking back. Isaiah stood frozen, the wooden bird digging into his palm. Ilara did not cry. She stared at the empty space where her husband had been, and then she began to hum the lullaby again, but the tune was broken now, the notes sharp and discordant. The shadow in her eyes had swallowed her whole. The chain that bound their family had been snapped, and the sound of its breaking would echo in Isaiah's mind for the rest of his life. The big house was a world of oppressive silence and gleaming surfaces. Isaiah, now 25, moved through its rooms like a ghost, his footsteps muffled by thick carpets. The air here was different, laced with the scent of beeswax, dried lavender, and a faint, ever-present hint of mildew. He had been brought from the fields 2 years prior, his intelligence and quiet demeanor marking him as a suitable house servant. A dangerous promotion. His primary duty was to attend to Master Alistair Whitethorn. The man was a study in controlled power. He spent his mornings in his study, a room lined with leather-bound books he never read, its centerpiece a large mahogany desk where he kept his ledger. That book was his Bible. In it, every human being on Whitethorn was reduced to a name, an age, and a dollar value. Alistair would trace the figures with a long, pale finger, his calculations cold and precise. "Isaiah, more ink," Alistair would say without looking up. His cruelty was not the hot, violent kind of his son. It was the chill of being itemized, of being a number in a column. It was in the grand hall dusting a gilded mirror that Isaiah first properly met Annabelle. She was a house servant, her complexion a testament to the blurred lines in the big house. She carried herself with a wary grace, her eyes missing nothing. "You watch him like a hawk." "Isaiah," she whispered, not stopping her work of arranging flowers in a vase. Her voice was low and melodic. He was startled she had spoken to him so directly. "I do my work." She glanced around quickly. "Hawks that watch too long get shot. Or worse, they get noticed." She held a deep red oleander bloom, its petals delicate and deadly. "These are pretty, aren't they?" Master Julian had them planted for their beauty. "He doesn't know they're poison." Isaiah looked at the flower, then at her. A understanding passed between them, unspoken but absolute. She saw the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. In this house of whispers and lies, he had found a confidant. The other inhabitants were orbiting planets of dysfunction. Julian Whitethorn, 22, was his father's opposite. He wore his cruelty like a fine cologne, lounging on the veranda with a glass of brandy, his eyes seeking out any sign of weakness. His silver-tipped cane was rarely used for walking. It was a pointer, a prod, a threat. Then there was Eleanor, 19, all softness and nervous energy. She would sometimes try to engage Isaiah in conversation, her voice full of a misplaced pity. "It's so terribly hot today, Isaiah. You must be uncomfortable in that jacket." She wanted to be kind, but her kindness was a reminder of the unbridgeable chasm between them. She was a prisoner of her privilege and he of his bondage. One afternoon, Isaiah was polishing the silver when Julian strode in, smelling of horse and whiskey. "You boy, my boots are muddy. Clean them." He put his foot up on a velvet-covered chair, grinning. Annabelle, entering the room with fresh linens, caught Isaiah's eye for a fraction of a second.
"A warning."
A command to endure. Isaiah picked up the boot brush. "Yes, sir." Julian leaned close, his breath foul. "My father thinks you're so clever, but I know what you are. You're all the same. You just need a firm hand." He tapped his cane against Isaiah's shoulder, a light, mocking touch. It took every ounce of Isaiah's will to keep his hands moving, to keep the rage locked away in a dark corner of his heart, next to the memory of his father and the tiny wooden bird. The incident began with a dropped cane knife. Ben, exhausted from a night of grinding, had let the heavy tool slip from his blistered hands. It was a mistake, a moment of human fallibility. But on Whitethorn, humanity was a flaw. Julian Whitethorn saw it happen. He spurred his horse forward, its hooves kicking up clods of earth. "Lazy brute," he shouted, his voice slicing through the morning air. "You think our equipment grows on trees?" Thomas Calhoun was there in an instant, his face flushed with anticipation. This was the part of his job he relished.
"Shall I take him to the barn, Mr. Julian?"
Alistair Whitethorn emerged from the house, drawn by the commotion. He stood on the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand, an observer of his own private theater. "No," Julian declared, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "We'll do it here, where everyone can see the cost of laziness. 20 lashes." He scanned the faces of the gathered workers, his eyes landing on Isaiah, who had been bringing a tray to the porch. "You, Isaiah, you'll assist Calhoun." A cold dread washed over Isaiah. The world seemed to narrow to the whipping post, a thick, scarred piece of timber stained dark in places. Ben was dragged forward, his protests muffled by fear. His eyes, wide with terror, found Isaiah's for a moment. Calhoun shoved the heavy, braided leather whip into Isaiah's hands. It felt alive, oily, and vicious. "Hold it for me, boy," Calhoun sneered. "I need my hands free to strip him." From the porch, Alistair took a sip of his coffee. "Don't ruin a good tool, Julian," he said, his voice calm. "There's a cost to everything. Remember the ledger?" Julian waved a dismissive hand. "This is an investment in discipline, Father." The first crack of the whip was a sound that tore the air apart. Ben's cry was a high animal thing. Isaiah flinched, his grip tightening on the whip he held. He was forced to watch as Calhoun's arm rose and fell with a practiced rhythm. Each impact was a sickening thud. Sarah stood at the front of the crowd of enslaved people, her face a stony mask, but a single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. After it was over, the silence was heavier than the noise had been. Ben hung from the post, his back a raw, bloody ruin. The air smelled of blood and sweat. Calhoun took the whip back from Isaiah, wiping his brow. "Lesson learned," he grunted. Julian looked pleased. "See that it is." Isaiah stood frozen, his hands trembling. He looked down at his palms, expecting to see them stained red. He looked toward the big house. Alistair was gone, back to his ledger. Julian was lighting a cigar. And by the porch, the oleander bushes bloomed, their pink and white flowers vibrant and innocent in the sunlight. In that moment, something cold and hard crystallized within Isaiah. The memory of his father's disappearance, the sound of his mother's broken song, and now Ben's screams fused into a single, unshakable purpose. The hawk was no longer just watching. It had seen where to strike. The secret meeting happened deep in the swamp, where the cypress knees rose from the black water like gnarled fingers. The air was thick with the chorus of frogs and the drone of mosquitoes. Sarah had led him there to a small dry hummock she used for gathering special herbs. "You asked about the oleander," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She held a leaf between her fingers. "It is a quiet death, a slow poison. It sickens the stomach, weakens the limbs, but most of all, it attacks the heart. It mimics a natural ailment." She looked at him, her old eyes seeing everything. "This is not a weapon of fire, child. It is a weapon of shadow. It asks for patience." "I have nothing but time, Aunt Sarah," Isaiah replied, his voice flat. "And hate." She showed him how to harvest the leaves without drawing attention, to dry them in a hidden place and to grind them into a fine, bitter powder. A little each day, in his coffee, his brandy. Too much and it will purge from his stomach. The body will reject it, but a little will be absorbed. It will accumulate. The heart will grow heavy and slow. Back in the pantry of the big house, Isaiah carefully transferred the powder into a small, hollowed-out bone needle case, easy to conceal. Annabelle was his lookout, her sharp ears tuned to the footsteps in the hall. She understood his goal without him ever speaking it aloud. Their bond, forged in silent understanding, was now a conspiracy. "There is a rhythm to this house," she whispered one evening as they worked. "Alistair takes his coffee alone at 8. Julian sleeps until 10. Eleanor takes her morning walk in the garden at 9. These are the moments, the empty spaces." The first near miss came when Julian, restless and hungover, wandered into the kitchen early one morning as Isaiah was stirring the master's coffee. "What's this? My father's favorite servant preparing his brew?" Julian loomed over him, his breath sour. "Just as I do every morning, sir," Isaiah said, his heart hammering against his ribs. Julian stared at him for a long moment, then snatched the cup and took a sip. He grimaced. "Bitter." He shoved it back into Isaiah's hands. "Tastes like poison." He laughed, a harsh bark, and walked away, oblivious to the truth of his own joke. The second was when Eleanor, returning from her walk, surprised him in the study. He was standing by the brandy decanter, the bone case in his hand. "Isaiah, is everything all right?" He slipped the case into his pocket and turned, forcing calm into his voice. "Just dusting, Miss Eleanor." The decanter collects a film. She smiled, a gentle, trusting smile. You are so diligent. Her innocence was a shield around her and a weapon against him. Every day was a tightrope walk over an abyss, each step measured, each breath held. The shadow weapon was being prepared, and the waiting was its own particular torture. The first dose was a mere pinch of pale green powder, vanishing into the dark, bitter coffee. Isaiah's hand was steady as he carried the tray into Alistair's study. The master took it without a word, without a glance, engrossed in his ledger. Isaiah stood by the door watching. Alistair drank. Nothing happened. The world did not end. It was profoundly, terrifyingly mundane. The days bled into weeks. The routine became a sacred, dreadful ritual, a pinch in the morning coffee, a sprinkle in the evening brandy. The poison was a slow, patient guest, taking up residence in Alistair Whitethorn's body. The first sign was a complaint of nausea over dinner. Alistair pushed his plate away. The meat is off, he grumbled, but the rest of the family had eaten from the same platter. Eleanor looked concerned. Julian shrugged, too deep in his wine to care. Then came the fatigue. Alistair, who had always possessed a wiry, relentless energy, began to falter. He dozed off at his desk. He started using his cane for support, a thing he had never done before. The plantation's doctor, a portly, complacent man named Dr. Lemoyne, was summoned. A congestion of the bile, Lemoyne announced, bled him with leeches and prescribed a foul-smelling tonic. Rest and quiet, Alistair. You are not a young man anymore. But Alistair was a man who understood systems. As his body betrayed him, his mind remained sharp. He began to watch Isaiah more closely, not with suspicion, but with a strange clinical curiosity. One afternoon, after a coughing fit that left him pale and trembling, he fixed his gaze on Isaiah. You are a good servant, Alistair wheezed, his eyes like chips of flint. Quiet, efficient, you never complain. Isaiah stood still, saying nothing. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken truth. The final dose was double the usual amount. The air in the bedroom was thick with the smell of camphor, and a sweet, cloying odor that Isaiah now recognized as the body's slow surrender. Alistair was a skeleton draped in silk, his skin a pale, yellowish hue. The family had been gathered and dismissed. Only Isaiah was left to attend him through the night. The house was silent. Outside, a full moon bathed the cane fields in an eerie silver light. Alistair's breathing was a ragged, irregular drag. Each inhale was a struggle, each exhale a rattling sigh. Isaiah sat in a chair by the bed, the wooden bird in his pocket, his fingers tracing its familiar shape. Alistair's eyes opened. They were clear, preternaturally so. He looked at Isaiah, and for the first time there was no ledger, no calculation, just the raw awareness of one man facing another at the final threshold. You, Alistair gasped, his hand twitching on the coverlet. You have been my most faithful attendant. Isaiah leaned forward, his voice low and steady. I am my father's son. Recognition, cold and absolute, dawned in Alistair's eyes. It was not a confession, but it was an understanding. The system of accounting had been overturned. The asset had become the agent. A flicker of hatred, pure and undiluted, passed over his ravaged features. Then it was replaced by something else. A terrible, grudging respect for the elegance of the revenge. His mouth worked, trying to form one last word. It might have been a name. Marcus. It might have been a curse. It was lost in a final wet gurgle as his body convulsed once, then stilled. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Isaiah did not move. He watched the corpse for a long time. He felt no triumph, no surge of victory, only a vast hollow emptiness. The chains he had worn his whole life were still there. He had just transferred their weight to his own soul. A floorboard creaked in the hall. He looked up. Annabelle stood in the doorway, her hand over her mouth. Her eyes were wide, filled not with horror, but with a profound and weary sadness. She had heard the silence fall. From down the hall, a door opened. Eleanor's voice, sleepy and confused, called out, "Papa, is everything all right?" Then a moment later, the scream. It was a high, piercing sound that shattered the stillness of the house, a sound of loss and terror that would hang in the rooms of Whitethorn forever. The reckoning was over. The aftermath had begun. The scream was a starting pistol. The big house, usually a bastion of controlled order, erupted into chaos. Eleanor threw herself on her father's corpse, sobbing hysterically. Julian, bleary-eyed and furious, burst into the room, his face purpling with rage. What happened? "Lemoyne! Send for Lemoyne!" he roared. Though the doctor could do nothing now, he grabbed Isaiah by the collar. "You, what did you do?" "I did nothing, sir," Isaiah said, his voice eerily calm. "The master's heart, it just gave out, as the doctor said it might." Julian shoved him away, his eyes wild. He didn't believe it, but he had no proof, only a gut-deep certainty of betrayal. The sheriff from town, a friend of the family named Porter, arrived with 2 deputies. The investigation was a brutal farce. Sheriff Porter questioned the house servants, his methods leaning heavily on threats and intimidation. Down in the quarters, a different kind of tension settled. The news traveled on the wind. The master is dead. There was no celebration, only a wary, fearful silence. Some, like Ben, who had recovered physically but was now a hollowed-out man, allowed himself a grim, private smile. Others huddled in their cabins, fearing the random punishment that would surely come. Sarah sat by her fire, listening to the shouts from the big house. "The shadow has done its work," she murmured to herself. Now comes the fire. Sheriff Porter's inquest concluded what the power structure required it to conclude. "Death by natural causes," he announced on the porch, tipping his hat to Julian. "A congenital weakness of the heart, likely. A tragedy, to be sure," Julian seethed. "Natural causes? My father was poisoned." "I know it." He glared at Isaiah, who stood silently by the door. "Without proof, Mr. Whitethorn, my hands are tied," Porter said quietly. "But keep a close watch on your property. The devil finds work for idle hands." With Alistair gone, Julian became the master of Whitethorn. His grief manifested not as sorrow, but as amplified cruelty. The first thing he did was dismiss Dr. Lemoyne and bring in a harder overseer to assist Calhoun. The whip fell more frequently. The rations were cut. The plantation became a prison under lockdown. Isaiah moved through his duties like an automaton. The hollow feeling inside him grew. He had expected to feel free, but he felt more trapped than ever. One night he met Annabelle in the secret space behind the laundry kitchen. "They know," she whispered. "They may not have proof for the law, but Julian knows. He watches you every second." "Let him watch," Isaiah said. But the defiance was gone from his voice. "It changes nothing. My father is still gone. My mother is still lost. Ben's back is still scarred. This was never about changing the past," Annabelle said, taking his hand. Her touch was the only real thing in the world. It was about balancing the scales. "And do they feel balanced to you?" he asked, his voice cracking for the first time. She didn't answer. The question hung in the air between them. The revenge had not been a cleansing fire, but a stone dropped into a pond, and the ripples of fear, of suspicion, of intensified oppression were still spreading, touching everyone. Julian's reign was worse than his father's, his brutality unchecked by cold calculation. The community was suffering for Isaiah's act. The weight of that knowledge was a new, heavier chain. Years later, after the war, after the proclamation, after the world had technically changed, an older Isaiah sat on the porch of a small, tidy cabin miles from Whitethorn. The lines on his face were deep, carved by sun and sorrow. Annabelle sat beside him, mending a shirt. They were free. The word still felt strange on the tongue. A young girl, their granddaughter, sat at Isaiah's feet. "Tell the story, Papa. The story of the Sugar King and the Riverman." Isaiah smiled a weary smile. He looked out at the land, now his own. "Well now," he began, his voice a low rumble. "They say there was a king who lived in a big white house, and his kingdom was made of sugar. But his sugar was grown with tears. And there was a man who worked for him, a quiet man who knew the secrets of the river. He told the story as a fable, a ghost tale. The specifics blurred, the poison became a river sickness, the master became a mythical sugar king. He never said, 'I am the river man.' He didn't have to. Annabelle would look at him and her eyes would tell the true story. The legend of Whitethorn took on a life of its own. In the nearby towns, people would whisper about the plantation where the master dropped dead of a broken heart. Some said his ghost walked the fields crying out for his ledger. Others said the oleander bushes that grew there were cursed, their blossoms a poisonous red. The song survived. The lullaby that Alara had sung, the one of the river carrying souls home, was sung to children in the freedmen's settlements. The origins were forgotten, but the melancholy melody remained. a thread connecting the present to a past that was too painful to speak of directly. Isaiah would sometimes take the small, worn wooden bird from his pocket. His granddaughter would look at it with curiosity. "What's that, Papa?" "It's a reminder," he would say softly, "that even when you can't fly, you must never forget what the sky looks like." The act of revenge had been a dark, necessary thing, a stone in a river. But the legacy was more complex. It was the cabin they lived in, the family they had built, the simple, profound fact of their freedom. The story was no longer just about poison and death. It was about survival and the terrible, complicated price it sometimes demanded. The truth was buried deep like a root, giving rise to a tree of many stories, some of them dark, some of them hopeful, all of them part of the same tangled, enduring legacy. The ruins of Whitethorn Plantation are still there if you know where to look. The white columns have long since fallen, reclaimed by moss and creeping ivy. The oleander bushes, however, grow wild and untamed, their flowers a shocking, vibrant pink against the green of the encroaching swamp. The story of Isaiah and Alistair Whitethorn is not a simple parable of good and evil. It is a gray, unsettling tale from the heart of America's original sin. It forces us to ask, what is justice in a system designed to make justice impossible? When the law is an instrument of oppression, does justice exist outside of it? Isaiah's rebellion was not a dramatic, bloody uprising. It was a silent, solitary war fought with the only weapons available to him: patience, intellect, and a deep, abiding knowledge of the enemy's habits. He did not become a hero. He became a man who carried a terrible secret to his grave. His story is a testament to the fact that the most potent poison was not oleander, but the institution of slavery itself, a toxin that corrupted everything it touched, master and enslaved alike. The only antidote, however flawed, however heartbreaking, was the relentless human will to assert one's own humanity, to say, even in a whisper, "You do not own me." The chains may have been broken by law, but the echoes of their clanking remain in the stories we tell, and in the silence that surrounds the stories we have forgotten. So, I leave you with the question that has haunted me since I first uncovered this legend. It's an uncomfortable one. If you were in Isaiah's place, bearing his pain, witnessing his losses, and facing the same impossible choices, what would you have done? Would you have endured the unendurable, hoping for a freedom that might never come? Would you have risked everything for a violent, desperate escape? Or would you have chosen the path of the shadow, of quiet, calculated revenge? Would you have stirred the poison into the master's cup? History is easy to judge from a distance, but true history demands empathy. It demands that we step into the shoes of those who came before, if only for a moment, and confront the terrible choices they faced. What would you have done? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you dare to walk these darker paths of history with us, to uncover the stories that challenge simple morals, then subscribe and ring the bell. Because the past isn't just a series of dates, it's a collection of choices, and their echoes are still asking us questions today. The story of Whitethorn is just one thread in a vast, tangled tapestry. For every Isaiah, there were thousands whose acts of resistance were never recorded. Their wars were fought not on battlefields, but in the quiet spaces, in a broken tool, a deliberately slow pace, a secret prayer meeting deep in the woods, a dangerous journey north guided by a song. Resistance was not a single act. It was a constant breathing thing. It was the will to survive, to preserve a name, a story, a soul, in a system designed to erase them. It was the profound courage to hope for a dawn they might never see. This has been the Slave Resistance, a channel dedicated to unearthing the stories of those who fought back against the unimaginable, the ones who plotted, who escaped, who rebelled, and who in countless quiet ways never, ever surrendered their humanity. We tell these stories not to dwell in darkness, but to honor the unbreakable light of the human spirit, to understand that the freedom we have today was paid for with their courage. If you believe these stories deserve to be heard, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Like this video if you were moved by Isaiah's impossible choice. Share it to ensure this history is never forgotten. Until the next story, remember them.